Service Committee, and moderating with me is Michelle. I'll let Michelle introduce herself.
Hi, my name is Michelle Duncan. I'm a partner of counsel at the law firm of Dinsmore and Shaw here in Louisville, Kentucky. Also representing the Charles W. Anderson Jr. Bar Association. And along with Sarah and her committee, we put today's forum together. This is our third Know Your Rights forum. So today, as you all know, is called Social Injustice, the current state of affairs, and how do we move forward from here? There are several instances that prompted the discussion that we want to have today, but specifically something happened in our own backyards. And I'm talking about the death of Breonna Taylor. It has sparked nationwide discussion. And so with us today, we have a distinguished panel to discuss what we've done so far, where we're going, what needs to be done, what should be done. And with that, I'll turn it over to Sarah to go through the introductions of each of our panelists.
We do have a fantastic panel with us tonight. And, it's always my perspective that we can say more about ourselves than other people can say about us. So I'm going to let our panelists introduce themselves. I will briefly give you the mic so that you can take over. Metro Council President James, why don't we begin with you?
Okay, thank you. First, I want to say thank you for having this discussion, and thanks for inviting me. My name is David James, and I'm the president of the Louisville Metro Council. And I serve as the councilman for the 6th District. I've been in that office for 10 years. Prior to that, I was a law enforcement officer for 30 years. And so I'm just happy to be here, and I'll turn it over to the next person.
Thank you so much. Marc Murphy, you are a political cartoonist for the CJ. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, my day job, I'm a member of the law firm of Stites and Harbison. I practice primarily criminal law during the day, and I also all night then draw for the Courier Journal. I'm a former prosecuting attorney. I was the Commonwealth's attorney here in Louisville, among other jurisdictions. And I am honored that you would have asked me to be a part of this.
Thank you, Mr. Murphy. Professor Powell.
Thank you so much. I'm honored to be here with my co-panelists. It's always a pleasure to talk about these difficult issues. I've been at the law school 27 years, and I am the Wyatt Terrence and Combs Professor of Law there. Thank you for having me.
So the first question we have is for Metro Council President James. I'd like to start just with an overview of the type of legislation that is already in place. I think several people will be familiar with Breonna's Law, which I believe is a no-knock ordinance. If you could tell us what exactly that is, and if it's different in any way from the billboards that I at least have been seeing around the city, which is Justice for Breonna Taylor Act.
So the Justice for Breonna Taylor Act is what is going on in the state legislature right now. There are a few legislators and senators, Gerald Neal, Nima Kulkarni, Attica Scott, have all been working on something like that. President of the Senate, Stivers, all of them have been working on some version of that. The Breonna's Law that we have here in Louisville was passed in July by the Metro Council. And basically it says that police do not do no-knock search warrants and for LMPD, and that they must wear body camera when they are doing the no-knock search warrant or doing search warrants for LMPD in the city. It only affects LMPD. It does not affect the other departments in the city. There are over 20 other police departments here in Jefferson County. And so the purpose of the state law would be to get those other jurisdictions to also abide by that.
And it's my understanding that Metro Council passed a de-escalation ordinance. Is that correct?
We passed a use of force ordinance. The use of force ordinance directed the chief of police to modify the policies and procedures for the Louisville Metro Police Department, designating when tear gas could be used, that would ban chokeholds and other uses of force within the police department.
Is there any other legislation that you anticipate passing to address some of the issues that have come to the forefront in light of the death of Breonna Taylor?
Sure. So one of the things that we did, we passed a resolution asking the FOP and the administration to, when they go back to the table to negotiate a contract, to please insert language that when an officer is involved in a critical incident, that a alcohol and urine test would be administered immediately following the incident. Currently, that's not taking place. And so it would seem logical that it would take place. We also passed a resolution asking for the administration to be more transparent. Currently, if you were to file an open records request today for, let's say, the 911 phone calls that take place in MetroSafe, you would be able to obtain those within 3 days. Mm-hmm. Unless somebody called and made a complaint. The moment they made the complaint, the police department then says that those documents, whatever it may be, the body camera footage, the 911 calls, are not subject to open records because it's, quote, under investigation. And so that is how the police department hides information from the public about what they are doing or not doing. And so the administration has been going along with that for the past 10 years and allowing that to take place. That's why we're still trying to get records about the Youth Explorer scandal, for example, that happened years ago. And the administration is still withholding that information. The problem with it also is that we have open investigations for professional standards, which is internal affairs, administrative investigations of police officers that were initiated in 2015 that are still not resolved. And therefore, all those documents, those recordings are still not able to be viewed and seen by the public or even the victims. And so it's a big problem that the administration has that they still have not fixed. And then I think that's all that we have going on right now as far as the police department is concerned. Also, we have the Civilian Review Board. I forgot about that. That was passed in December with the Office of Inspector General. And we are meeting with the state legislature right now to try to get subpoena power for the Inspector General's office. It's a vital part of being able to conduct investigations. There is some resistance in the state legislature towards that. And so there will be more meetings scheduled to hopefully be able to get that accomplished.
Council President, are you aware of any coordination between Metro Council and the state legislature regarding legislation to address racial inequality and the policing of minority communities?
Outside of the subpoena power issue with the state legislature?
Yeah.
We have been talking to the state legislature about issues related to policing and patterns and practices of police departments and those type of studies. But there has not been any traction on any of that at this point.
Professor Powell, the next question is for you. I know you've written a lot of scholarly articles, but specifically you've written about the United States Supreme Court's race-neutral rulings and how they have perpetuated inequality. So the question is, first, can you explain that to us? And then are there any Kentucky court decisions that you anticipate will have a similar effect?
Okay, I can paint the broad picture. I'm not sure about Kentucky cases because I don't know any. I'm a federal constitutional law scholar, but I can still do it. Let me try it this way. So what I examine is the narrative structure of the US Supreme Court's decisions. And my key argument is that the court oftentimes rationalizes oppression and subjugation that's already in place. And so there's neutral language in all of these decisions that give us the impression that discrimination has ended, that there is no present day effects of past discrimination, and you take a very formalistic view of equality. Everyone's equal, so whenever you talk about race, that's unconstitutional because it's not neutral. Whenever you look at race, the US Supreme Court says, we're going to be very skeptical of any governmental action because we can't tell the difference between the use of race that might be malicious or malign, or we can't tell the difference between the positive use of race. So there are these neutral rationales in the US Supreme Court decision-making process. One is that in order to find any discrimination under the 14th Amendment, you have to prove that the state acted intentionally to discriminate. So people who bring discrimination claims, they have a very difficult time because they talk about disproportionate impact. This entire discussion we're having about structural inequality and the impact on communities of color. If we brought a claim to the US Supreme Court, the US Supreme Court would say, yes, that exists, but this is social discrimination. It has no connection to anything that the state did. And this proportionality can be explained a number of different neutral ways. That's just the way things are. We have a marketplace where things happen and people make decisions. But unless you can point to the state actively being involved in discrimination, discrimination is unreachable. So a couple of examples of that. You remember, this is about 6 years ago, the voting rights case, and everyone's talking about voter suppression. Well, what comes out of that is a case called Shelby County versus Holder. In that case, you probably remember, the US Supreme Court says that we don't need the Voting Rights Act. Neutrality. There is no discrimination that you can point to. You have African-American mayors, governors, and even a president. So that shows that we really don't need the Voting Rights Act. States should be allowed to determine their own destiny. So the court says that state sovereignty is really important, and you can't discriminate against covered jurisdictions who have a long history of discrimination. But Chief Justice Roberts says, well, it's 2013. We're not talking about 1967. We don't have a poll tax. We don't have lynching anymore. And you have Black people winning elections. So what you're really asking for is special treatment based upon the race. That's a form of reverse discrimination. And so we don't need the Voting Rights Act. That's one example. Another example is the long line of school cases. We could spend the whole hour talking about school cases, but everyone knows Brown versus Board of Education, but really there was 20 years of intransigence after Brown versus Board of Education. Nothing really happened. There's a 14-year period where nothing happened. And then there's this case called Green, which says school districts have an affirmative duty to dismantle dual school systems. This is in 1968, 14 years after Brown. And then after that, there were a series of cases that gave federal courts broad power. But in 1974, one of the worst decisions that the US Supreme Court made, a case called Milliken versus Bradley. This is another example of neutrality. The court said, unless you can point to intentional discrimination within the school district that impacts another district, interdistrict, you can't have busing as a remedy. So that made discrimination stop at the school boundary line. And you see what happens in 1974 all the way up to now. We are sort of segregating. But that's another example of neutrality. The suburbs had nothing to do with racial discrimination. People made individual choice to move to the suburbs, and that says nothing about a dual school system. So in Michigan, you cannot hold the school districts responsible for discrimination that they didn't create. So that's one. And then finally, there was a case in 2014 called Schuette versus by any means necessary, affirmative action. Another example of neutrality. This was a case where the voters of Michigan voted on a voter initiative that said race should not be considered in school admissions, public contracting, or anything. So everything must be race neutral. So you had the citizenry of Michigan actually voting upon a constitutional amendment to make everything colorblind. So you know what happened with affirmative action at the University of Michigan School of Law. Same thing happened in California with proposition. I can't remember the number, but it was the anti-affirmative action proposition. All of these things are termed neutrally, but what happens is it retrenches inequality. Same thing finally can be said about the debate that we're having about criminal justice. And it's amazing to me how some of the rhetoric sort of circulates. You have reasonable fear on the parts of police officers, and that gives a presumption that appropriate force was used when the police officer's life is in danger. And that's why people are so outraged whenever they see a police officer getting off. The explanation is a neutral one. They were on the street, they had a reasonable fear for their life. This was a response to a threat. And even though it could be viewed as excessive, there's a rational way for it. Same thing with Breonna Taylor. We look at what Attorney General Cameron said, the same type of neutral rhetoric. The police had a right to be there. Whether or not the warrant was faulty or not, they had to engage. They have to protect themselves, reasonable fear, and the presumption is that they can use this force. So that's the way that neutrality sort of flows through all of the U.S. Supreme Court cases. And I think if there was a Kentucky case that we would look at, I don't have anyone in mind, but you see how neutrality sort of glosses over the inequality and impact that actually occurs because of structural inequality.
So just in follow up to that, Professor Powell, and I'm just kind of going off the top of my head, but in what you just said, it comes to mind prosecutorial discretion. Would that be part of the structure that perpetuates racial inequality, specifically with the Breonna Taylor case? Because as you mentioned, AG Cameron, he made a number of statements and some would say some assumptions as to how that warrant was executed and things he would and would not present to the grand jury.
Yeah, and so this selective use of information or evidence is what we're talking about. I think that is what caused some of the uproar. I mean, how can you sort of look at facts in isolation without even incorporating race into it? So his reasoning for the way things turned out seems very rational and neutral, but without that component that looks at the criminalization of Black bodies, the disproportionate impact of that force upon Black communities, the legitimization of state violence against Black bodies, then that's totally in isolation. And you have the Attorney General saying, well, this was a neutral decision. We looked at the evidence, but that evidence is viewed in a way that presumptively favors police action. And so you don't look at disproportionate impact. You don't look at excessive force. You only look at the result and then reason backwards for rationalization. And I think that's why there's so much anger in the community.
This next question, it really is for anyone on the panel, sticking to the topic that Professor Powell is speaking on. How do we change this? What can we do about it? Is it diversity within the police force? Is it diversity amongst the judiciary? Is it police officers actually living in the neighborhoods that they are policing?
Well, I'll follow up just, and then I'm going to be quiet. I keep talking and talking. So I'll just say this one thing. I think, let me tie this in with what's happening in DC. The insurrection, what is really interesting is Now we're doing this audit of structures and systems that may be racist. There was a report that laid on the table. No one was really paying attention to it, but people are paying attention to it now. There's a 2016 report by the FBI on white supremacist infiltration in law enforcement. And now recently you heard today that some National Guardmen have been relieved of duty because of their possible connection with the insurrection. So there is this notion that diversity solves everything, or training. I think we need to go deeper than that. I don't think you can train this problem away. I think it's a structural problem. And so one of the things we need to do is a full-scale audit of governmental systems, government, the police, the military, to see how these structures operate and impact communities of color, and then see how the systems and procedures sort of impact communities and whether or not those systems are racist or not. So I think it's more than having people of color on the bench or people of color in the police department, because what we have is a structural problem. And then if you just place individuals within that structural system, you're not really changing that. You have good individuals, but how can they operate within a system that's flawed?
President James, do you have any ideas as to how we could move forward? And do you agree with Professor Powell that we can't just train the problem away?
No, I would agree with what Professor Powell just said. And I would also add that, I think it's important also that there is diversity on the departments, not only and at the officer level, but all the way to the top. Because without that, there's not some cultural enforcement is what I often call it. During my time especially early on in the police department, it was not unusual for me to confront a white colleague about what they said to an African-American suspect. And I would say things like, I don't ever want to hear you say that word again to anybody. And so, and that changed behaviors in a different way, right? It was already, they knew they weren't supposed to do it, but because everybody looked like them and they act like them, no one was going to correct them. And then when Black officers started being hired on the department, then we started inserting ourselves into those situations, and it helped create change. And so I think there's a lot of things that will help make that happen. I think the Civilian Review Board and civilian oversight, just the fact that people are going to be held accountable. KRS 67C was written to create consolidated local government, but it was written with the belief that things were going to be going well. It wasn't written with the belief that we would have a mayor that would refuse to hold the police chief accountable for anything. And so, so we have to make some modifications and make changes for things like that no one foresaw.
Marc, I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about what you do. You've created numerous political cartoons for the Courier-Journal that eloquently highlight these issues. I would like to discuss a couple of those specifically, but before we turn to those, what do you believe is the source of the disconnect here? Metro Council unanimously passes Breonna's law, but we don't have a state law that prohibits the use of no-knock warrants. And at the federal level, there's still no consensus on what police reform looks like, if any. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, there's a disconnect between Louisville, for instance, and the work that Metro Council President James is doing here in our city and the rest of the state over these issues, because there's a disconnect between Louisville and the rest of the state over a lot of things. I was about to say in our lifetimes, but it was only about 2 years ago, a Black state representative from Louisville was told by a white colleague on the floor of the House of Representatives to sit down, as if it was 1863 again. And I call them friends. I hope they would say the same about me, but I speak relatively frequently with Representative Scott. And you can read what she has to say and what she tries to get done and what goes on in Frankfurt. And the fact that we have generally a body of legislators, the majority in the House of Representatives in Kentucky, that are going to affirmatively, and I don't think I'm exaggerating by saying this, the history is there, the track record is there. They're going to affirmatively not take steps that are going to be to the advantage of first of all, the urban area of Louisville, and then secondly, the people that are representing those interests in that community in Louisville. You know, one of the problems, getting back to what Professor Powell mentioned, was also in terms of the disconnect is trust. And what can we do? And I've almost concluded that all these other ideas are good, but all we can do is elect people who will listen and elect people who can be trusted. You know, the Breonna Taylor decision was probably the most important decision that a prosecutor in the United States of America made last year. It may have been the most important decision that a state attorney general has made in the United States in the last decade. You know, people in Kurdistan are wearing Breonna Taylor t-shirts. So the whole world was watching. And what was more disappointing to me, and Daniel Cameron's a former colleague of mine. I was the first lawyer that Daniel Cameron ever worked for at Stites and Harbison. And what was more disappointing to me than the decision, which was mightily disappointing, was that he lied about the decision. Was that, and David knows this, probably Professor Powell knows this, I know you know this, Sarah. Well, everybody on the screen knows this, but as lawyers watching him talk about the decision that he made, he didn't come out and say, I chose not to present certain evidence against the officers that would have implicated them in the killing of Breonna Taylor. He could have said that. We would have respected his clarity, and it would have helped perhaps build a level of trust. Instead, he used the most complicated jargon that he possibly could. And I'm presented cases to the grand jury here in Jefferson County. I've defended cases. I've represented witnesses at the grand jury. And it wasn't even really clear to me, watching Daniel Cameron's decision, what happened in that grand jury. He wanted the world to believe, and if some lawyers hadn't prompted some journalists to plumb further into his decision, we may never know that in reality, he made those decisions himself. And then he tried to deceive the public with that. And if you're on the streets, and if you talk to the people that are in Injustice Square and the people that are leading this movement right now, trust and the failure of trust is right at the top of the list. And it's not a list of demands. You know, the Citizens Review Board or Breonna's Law and all of these other things, which are incredibly important. This is such a general and such a deep-seated problem. We can't, here we're in Louisville right now, we can't trust the mayor for the reasons that have already been generally described. We can't trust the attorney general for the reasons that I've just discussed. And we don't know, we being the community, don't know who to trust. As Professor Powell said, I think that the United States generally, and when I say the United States generally, I mean white people. And I'm the white panelist here. And I can tell you that when Barack Obama was elected, virtually all of the people with whom I ordinarily associate with, whether it's my law firm or other places, concluded that we had now reached the post-racial society and that our work here is done. And then you fast forward to the decision in the Shelby case, where it was decided that our work here is also done when it comes to voting rights, that we're all good. And, you know, I don't know if Stephen Jobs one day will have a place on the Washington Mall, but without video cameras on our cell phones, most of the world may still not hear the cries of that community and may not know. We wouldn't know about George Floyd. We wouldn't know about these other things. And if the government in Louisville, mayor, chief of police, attorney general, had their way, we wouldn't even know about Breonna Taylor. So, you know, I haven't said a word about cartoons yet, but you asked a more broad question and I apologize. But I think the question is trust. We have to elect people who, from rich to poor, black and white, top to the bottom of the economic scale, can trust one way or the other. And right now we've gone through 4 years, with the exception of perhaps the last year and a half with our governor in the Commonwealth of Kentucky, of looking up upstream all the way to the White House, and not only not trusting these people, but being in a position of assuming they're not telling us the truth. And as my grandfather used to say, that's no way to run a railroad.
Thank you for those remarks. And we'll turn to cartoons now, since we have not talked about them yet. Starting with the UK basketball cartoon. So in the wake of the death of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, UK announced that they had 2 research initiatives to address systemic racism. However, when its men's basketball team kneeled in protest of racial inequality and asked fans to support the Black Lives Matter movement, they received a huge backlash. The Knox County Fiscal Court adopted a resolution asking the governor to reallocate tax funds given to UK, and Republican Kentucky Senator Rob Stivers said he was hurt by the teens' protest because of his family's military ties. UK also found that Black Lives Matter signs on campus describing the experiences of their current African-American students violated the school's signage policy. Does the messaging match the actions?
No, in no way does it. I'm a veteran. My son served in Afghanistan. My father fought in the Battle of the Bulge. It isn't that hard to understand why these athletes knelt when they did. It's never been hard to understand that. And for Senator Stivers to cry in my seat of government over the conduct of these young men, who, by the way, are just students. You know, they're anywhere, well, they're one and dones generally at UK, so they're 18 years old. They don't have any 23-year-olds on that team. Young men finding their way in the world who have grown up in the world that we've been describing to express their opinion, the most American thing that you can do. And his first and immediate and most public, very, very intentional response is to complain about their actions rather than to try to address why they were kneeling. That's the problem. And that was one man, one act, a very public thing to do, not a surprise in that regard. But then for entire county governments and for others around the state to have that reaction. And, you know, I have some very good friends who are UK fans. I have some very good Black friends who are UK fans. And there are some fine people who cheer for the Wildcats. I'm not one of them. But it's not unfair to say that that wasn't a reaction. That reaction to that kneeling wasn't a surprise. And even Coach Cal, who actually, as a Louisville fan, I like Coach Cal. I have to say, he walked back. He's taking care of his young man, I get that. But he walked back even the actions that they took because there's so much pressure in this state. And I think that one of the things that's happened, fortunately because of the cell phone videos, fortunately because of the raising awareness that we've seen, and I do my extremely small part trying to do that with the cartoons, is that we have seen that we were never a post-racial society. And in fact, I don't know whether it's fair to say, and I'm not in a position, I shouldn't be the one saying this, whether it's worse than it has been, or whether we just know now that it's worse than we thought it was.
Mark, I'm trying to see if we can actually share the screen and display your political cartoon, because I personally felt that it was spot on. In a similar vein, we, in the wake of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and too many others, unfortunately, we've seen company after company issue a statement in support of the movement, in support of equality and what they won't stand for. And yet here we are dealing with the issues we're dealing with, which is a college basketball team takes a knee for reasons that they believe are justified. And yet that was the response. And I was particularly interested in the fact that it's a government entity that is actually asking that their taxes be reallocated for the very thing that America is supposed to stand for, which is freedom of speech and our right to protest.
Well, and the thing is, when they took the knee, if we reflect back a week, it wasn't just generally speaking a Black Lives Matter knee, like you saw during the NBA bubble or that you see otherwise, going all the way back to Colin Kaepernick. They took the knee, as I recall, the very day after the insurrection in the Capitol. And I don't know what the discussion was in the locker room. I suspect from other things that I've heard and from the things that people have said unassociated with the UK basketball team, is that, you know what we did? We watched on TV where armed white people dressed for war breached our nation's capital, and video after video after video surfaces. And these people are being told to politely, please leave the Capitol building. Whereas let's make it more specific. Whereas State Representative Attica Scott, her daughter, and Shamika Parrish Wright are walking peacefully down a deserted street at night in Louisville, Kentucky, and they're arrested, cuffed, jailed, spend the night in jail, and charged with felonies. Mm-hmm. So if you're a 19-year-old one and done young man who's grown up in a Black family and has been listening and paying attention for all of this time, and you see that all day on TV, and the FBI and the government says, we need to find out who those people were, when they could have all been arrested at the scene, jailed, cuffed, and charged with felonies. Instead, you see them treated that way compared to how State Representative Scott, a member of our legislature, was treated here in Louisville, Kentucky. If that doesn't make, well, that should make everybody want to take a knee, not just the young Black basketball players. You're showing the cartoon I can see on the, and that's the dichotomy of, and that's not just, it looks like I'm picking on UK fans because of course he's wearing a Kentucky jersey. So I guess that's fair. But this picture could be used to describe a lot of sports fans and how we've treated sports and the athletes that we would kill to have an autograph from on the one hand, but don't care when they're killed by a cop on the other.
Marc, you've really hit the nail on the head that it comes down to restoring trust, which is actually the perfect segue to our next question is community healing. How do we move forward if, despite all of the conversations about the reasons why people are protesting, specifically here in Louisville, but just across the country, if people continue to hold views such as kneeling is disrespectful to the flag?
I'll let somebody else take a stab at that first.
So again, we need to break through the neutral rhetoric. You see, the entire discussion that we've been having really illustrates how whenever we try and talk about anti-racist activism or progressive policies, the right really tries to sort of find this false symmetry. So for example, the insurrection, there's a debate about whether or not these people are patriots, they are trying to save their government, libertarianism, and they have a right to do that. But their bodies were not criminalized. Marc made that point. Their bodies weren't brutalized. I mean, they walked up the steps with rifles and got into the Capitol. Now, if that was a Black Lives Matter movement, there would have been sharpshooters on the dome and they would have mowed them down. And then they would have said, well, that was a reasonable response. There was an insurrection and our government was in peril. So we had to take this state legitimized disproportionate response against protesters. So one thing we have to do is to break through this rhetoric. Kneeling on the basketball court at a public university is the exercise of the First Amendment right, freedom of speech. The state cannot regulate the content of that speech. So I think the things that the county and government was talking about, taking away tax initiatives, I think that would be unconstitutional if they were making those decisions based upon the content of the speech. They're making a value judgment about what they want to hear. they're making a value judgment of how they want Black people to be. They want Black people to participate in their own oppression. You can dribble the ball for us if you just be quiet, but whenever you stand up for yourself, we're gonna say, shut up. So that's the dichotomy. I think we have to move away from this symmetry between oppression and what people call freedom, but it really isn't. I think we all have to be dedicated and know that racism is permanent and adaptable. Because I think really we are in the third Reconstruction. Right after the Civil War, we had the first Reconstruction, the rise of the Klan, this lost cause mythology. Then 100 years pass, we do Brown versus Board of Education. That's the second Reconstruction. We had the emergence of the Confederate flag, which flew for the first time ever in the Capitol just a week and a half ago, a treasonous flag based upon this notion of state rights. And now we're in Reconstruction, and it's post-racial. So we have to break through that. And the first way to do that is stop going back and forth about whether or not this is neutral or the reasoning behind it. We see the impact of what happened to George Floyd. We see the impact of what happened to Breonna Taylor. We see the impact of what happened in the insurrection just 10 days ago. And so we have to make sure that the dialogue and action that we're having is real in reality and not some notion of neutrality.
President James, did you have anything to add? You're on mute.
Sorry, thank you.
Okay.
I would just simply add to that and agree with everything that they said. I would say, the UK players kneeling at the basketball game, I would agree. They were just expressing their thoughts about police treatment in America of African Americans. I just this past Friday went and had 3 root canals on my teeth. You may say, well, why is that? And that's because when I was 15 years old, the police broke my teeth for no apparent reason when I was walking down the street home from a football game. And so now, years later, I'm having to deal with that. And so when people say, well, I haven't seen what they're talking about. Well, I've seen it, I've experienced it. And most people my age have experienced it. And so I've always tried to tell people, then, you're not in the same wrapping that I'm in sometimes. And I'm not in the same wrapping that you're in. So I don't know and experience life as you experience it. And you haven't experienced life as I've experienced it. And I would say that, and I'd have you reflect back during Governor Bevin's administration, when all the gun laws were really let go. And I remember saying to people, this is going to be okay until Black people start carrying guns. And when NFAC showed up in Louisville for their protest, my phone lines and phone bank at City Hall literally got locked up from so many people calling saying, what are you going to do to stop these Black people from coming to our town with guns? Now, granted, when the 3%ers come, I get a few calls, and I'm not saying that I support people coming in town and protesting with guns. I don't, whether they black, white, green, or purple. However, I referred them back to when they were chanting and wanting there to be the right to carry guns and everybody can carry a gun without a permit just a few short years ago. And I'd say, well, talk to your legislature. You wanted it. Here it is. Good luck. And so I think that there's a double standard that takes place. And I think that we have to recognize that standard is real. And I am for certain that when you look at that, there's one picture where you see the insurrectionists climbing the wall at the Capitol. And I have told people, if they were climbing the wall like that at the Capitol and those were African Americans, they'd all been shot. And so I just think that we have to think about that. And we don't like talking about it. it's not a comfortable conversation. I'm sure some people are looking at me right now thinking, I wish he'd just shut up. But it's true. And it's the soonest we can all say that it's true and recognize that it's true, we can move forward. But as long as we keep trying to hush that conversation, it makes it very difficult to move forward.
Well, and that conversation has to be had by white people as well. And we've had this conversation many times, and David and I have shared the Zoom screen. We never talked personally, except when we worked together briefly when I was Commonwealth's attorney. The laws aren't going to change with just Black votes. The elected officials aren't going to just change, except in the rarest of cases, with just Black votes. And we've got to somehow educate the white community to understand that these are real issues, that no one is, we're beyond the point when anybody should have to be convinced that an officer, for instance, knelt on the neck of George Floyd for however many seconds, however many minutes, 8 minutes, 8 minutes, 24 seconds, I think. Video after video after video. And time passes, and time serves the interest of the establishment. And justice, as we say in the law, justice delayed is justice denied. But, we say Breonna Taylor's name now. We don't say David McAtee's name anymore. And the governor, with the mayor's approval or vice versa, called the National Guard in. They walked their butts right down to the West End where nothing was happening and killed a man. And that's faded. I don't know when that's going to be addressed or how it's going to be addressed. There could be investigation taking place. Breonna Taylor's case, we're waiting now for a new U.S. attorney to be appointed because all avenues, literally every single state prosecutorial avenue in the Commonwealth of Kentucky has been exhausted to try to get some level of justice for Breonna Taylor. So we're waiting to see if a new federal prosecutor, the U.S. attorney, is going to be appointed, and whether he'll listen to these concerns. I fear that because people like me walk around, as David put it, in a different wrapper than he does, we're wrapped differently, it doesn't confront us. It does, when my sons were growing up, I never had to tell them how to act when they were stopped by the police. And they're bad drivers. They were stopped a lot, and they always walked away. I never had a concern that they wouldn't walk away. I'm not bothered when I'm stopped for an expired tag. I'm not worried. I'm not a woman, obviously, or a Black woman when I'm jogging. I don't have any of these concerns. And so the white majority can quite easily move on. Think that some level of justice has been done. There'll be some idea that some policemen got fired. There'll be some idea that I think Breonna's law was passed. We'll think, but our lives move on. And most of our representatives and most of our presidents and most of our governors are white. And the people who make our laws are white. And most of the Metro Council is the same way. And so we'll be fine. The problem, I hope that we've seen this summer, is that we won't be fine. And we're not fine. And I worry that as time passes, until the next reminder hits our video screens, and I hope that it doesn't, but until the next reminder hits our video screens, then the most important allies can too easily move on and forget.
Thank you, Marc, for those comments. One of the things that we've talked about tonight is trust and finding trust in our leadership. Metro Council President James, how did the police search committee determine that Chief Shields was the best person to serve as LMPD's next chief of police? And do you believe that hiring Chief Shields will help the community heal in light of her recent resignation as Atlanta chief of police following the killing of Rayshard Brooks?
Sure. So there were 8 people on the selection committee. Myself, Councilman Green, Councilman Peden, Kendall Boyd from the mayor's office, Vincent James from the mayor's office, some other people. Of the 8 people, 6 were Black, 2 were white. And we started out with 28 applications, and we immediately narrowed that down to like 18. And then we just started interviewing people. Chief Shields was one of those people. And she literally rose off the table above everybody else with her responses to addressing issues of equity and inclusion within the police department, unlike any other candidate that we interviewed. So once we narrowed it down to the final 5 people, I think it was, we ranked those people and sent the names over to the mayor. Chief Shields was number 1 on that list. And we discussed, we all said who we wanted to be number 1 on the list without talking to each other. And she was number 1 by everybody. Her responses of inclusiveness, the recognition of policing and the history of policing as it relates to African Americans was spot on. There was nobody in that group of people that even came close to those type of responses. The fact that she resigned from Atlanta, we all took it as a sign of an ability to accept responsibility about something that truly wasn't your fault, but you still did it because you were the person in charge. And when I think about Mayor Fisher, who has never accepted responsibility for anything he's ever screwed up, or Steve Conrad, who was the chief of police that never accepted anything for he screwing up. And then you have this police chief that said, hey, I wasn't there that night in that parking lot, but I took immediate action and fired him afterwards. I applaud that. So people that are saying that she ran away or whatever that might be, I don't put any credit to that. That's just my opinion. Everybody's entitled to their opinion, but that's just how I see it.
Marc, I'm going to share my screen, or at least attempt to, and put up the political cartoon that you did that directly concerns this issue, and ask you to weigh in on it. I certainly understand President James's comments that Chief Shields was not there at the time that the Brooks incident occurred. However, she was the chief of police, and accepting responsibility, I think, comes with that title. Along that same lines, when you say accept responsibility, that happened, I think, this summer, and here we are in January, and she's already been rehired. So how much responsibility really was taken? But Marc, I'll turn it over to you, and you can explain your political cartoon, and we can go from there.
Part of political cartooning is, and it was very enlightening to hear what Council President James described in terms of the search committee. It's interesting to hear, important to hear that without speaking to one another, every one of them picked her first as the first candidate. People who talked with her and saw her took her measure, I guess you could say, in the interview. Part of what I consider to be my obligation when I do a political cartoon is to present an issue to the community. I gave a presentation quite a while ago, and a psychiatrist came up to me afterwards and told me something I didn't know, and maybe other people know this intuitively, but people absorb information from words in a very different way, almost using different parts of their brain, I guess. I'm sure she put it better than that. Then they absorb information from images. She related it back to our caveman times and all these other things. And so when people are reading words, it's intellectualized. It's more difficult for a writer. It's a really good writer who can tug at your emotions or spark some of the reactions that I get with my art with just words. I knew that there was a pretty substantial reaction amongst a lot of citizens in the community that this police chief would be the next, the Rashad Brooks police chief would then be the Breonna Taylor police chief. And that's what I was trying to express with this cartoon. What I like to happen after cartoons are published, which unfortunately happens too rarely, is that then there's a discussion about that. How did this, they hit emotionally, they make you feel things. And, the classic example is during war, for instance, in Afghanistan, editorial writers can write pages and pages and pages about the blood of soldiers that is spilled in Afghanistan. You read that, you're used to reading that. It does have an impact. But if I draw a soldier, an American soldier, who's lying in his own blood, to make the same point, I mean, they have to shut down the building at 4th and Broadway, 5th and Broadway, 6th and Broadway, that building, because of the anger that generates. I wish that we were in a society, in a point in society right now in terms of social media, where there could be good discussion about these sorts of issues. But most of the time, almost immediately, the people that are the most vocal are the ones that are the angriest about what they have just seen. And so it sort of trumps, it sort of trumps the, for lack of a better word, I guess, it sort of trumps the discussion about the issue that underlies it. So I was trying to represent the emotions there of a big part of the community to the choice.
Professor Powell, I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about another issue that's been particularly important this summer as we've moved through the discussions regarding social injustice, and that's the national discussion about defunding the police. Do you believe that a reallocation of police resources can help eradicate the racial inequalities in Louisville and more broadly the country as a whole?
Well, that's an excellent question. And it's sort of, again, neutrality. I think that the way that the debate was framed really threw us off course, because you remember in the political campaign, excuse me, the discussion was, oh, you're going to defund the entire police department. There was a really devastating political commercial that President Trump used in his campaign, where people were calling up for help from the police, and the line was busy, and it was this automated message. So I think that got into people's minds. So I don't think the proper term is defund. I think it's reallocate and demilitarize. There are some things that we spend money on in police departments structurally that if you spend money on those things, you're going to use them. And so one way to think about policing is a proportionate use of force in particular situations. It doesn't have to be a military response. And sometimes the police officers are ill-equipped to deal with these problems, and maybe a therapeutic response if you have someone who's mentally ill. So the first response should not just be this broad show of force, which could escalate. The problem should be one that deals with social and therapeutic responses. Now, how that looks, that's something that we would have to talk about, but it's not defunding, it's reallocating our priorities and lessening the use of military devices in policing. If it's community policing, then really that's what it should be. It shouldn't be a response, an armed response, unless absolutely necessary. In some situations, the first response should be one that deals with social services. So I think what I'm saying is I agree with the proposition that if we reallocate funds, that will help us a long way. You can make the same argument with global militarization as well. Must our response always be a military one? Can it be a diplomatic one? And of course, not to be naive or anything, sometimes you have to use force in order to protect national interests and global interests. But we have to ask ourselves, should that be the first response, particularly domestically and internationally?
Thank you. Same question to you, Council President James. Do you think that reallocation of resources is something that should be done to help address these issues? And what reallocation of resources can Louisville realistically do?
Sure. So I'd like to address something that the professor said for a moment. I often hear people talk about the militarization of the police department. And I often say to them, well, what exactly are you talking about? And they'll bring up, the armored car. And I'll say, oh, you mean the armored car that we used to get the 7 people that were shot the first night of protesting, that 2 of which would have bled to death if we didn't have that armored car? And so, the militarization of the police is a broad topic, and I just ask that people be more specific about what they're talking about. Number two.
Okay, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I think Ferguson is an example of militarization. I think the armored car argument, the rationale that you give is good and appropriate. I think it saved lives, but I guess when I'm being specific, when I say militarization, is the use of weapons that would normally be used in combat, and you use them on the street, and then that leads to escalation and disproportionate force. I think on some level, Ferguson is an example of that. So that's the type of force I was talking about.
Okay. So what I would say to that is, in Ferguson, they didn't deploy it properly, nor did they use it properly. I believe there's a use for such weaponry within the police departments. Otherwise, our bad guys are going to outgun our police, because they definitely have those weapons. We saw that on January 6th. So if you send our police out to confront people that have military weapons and all they have are pistols, police aren't going to win. So on top of that, I guess I would agree with what the professor said. I acknowledge and believe that we often send police to incidents that we shouldn't be sending the police to, whether that's to deal with people with mental illness or homelessness or whatever that may be. We use the police as the hammer for everything. And if you use it for the hammer for everything, then everything looks like a nail. And so should we have mental health specialists and social workers responding or co-responding with the police to help deal with certain situations? And will that help alleviate funding or lift funding to be able to do that? Absolutely. And the Metro Council put money in the budget this year to do that, and slowly, much slowly than the council wants. The city's slowly working its way there. But I believe that it will happen. I think we will find deflection programs to work with. We're talking with Centerstone and the University of Louisville School of Public Health about those exact things as we speak, just earlier today. So I think we'll get there. I think hopefully we'll get there much sooner than later. Within the next few months, we'll have an experiment ready to roll, and we'll see how that goes, and then we'll make some refinements along the way. And I don't refer to it as defunding the police. I talk about reallocations. I talk about redefining what public safety looks like. I think when you use terms like defunding the police, it scares people. And so I think finding better ways to reimagine what public safety looks like is a better way to talk about those things.
Thank you for that. Just a note to our audience, if you have questions that you'd like to ask of our panelists, you can put those in the comments of the Facebook feed, and we will get those and ask those as appropriate. We did receive one question in the chat so far. Marc, I'll direct this to you to start with, since it deals with criminal law. The question is centered on the penal code and the fact that it appears designed to specifically disenfranchise and incarcerate the poor and people of color. This is an issue that we've been talking about in the legal community for a long time. The question is, can we work within this framework as it's currently set up within this system, or do we throw it all the way out and start over? What are your thoughts?
I don't think well, practically speaking, I don't think that you could throw it out and start all over. I can't imagine, for instance, the criminal law is written by the state legislature, and I wouldn't want to give this state legislature or anyone that I can envision within my lifetime the opportunity to rewrite the criminal code. But backing up one step from that, substantial changes need to be made for sure. No one, in a way, it's no one's fault. No one gets elected to go to Frankfurt or to go to Washington and take away laws. They're lawmakers. They're called lawmakers. They're not called law takers. So everybody campaigns on a premise that they're going to make a law to do something. Now we're going to have a whole lot of new laws, for instance, in Washington, D.C. that apparently deal with insurrection when there's fine laws, I think. Professor may disagree with me, that deal with what happened on January 6th. We've been fighting a war on drugs, and among this panel, Officer James, Metro Council Member James, has been on the front lines of the war on drugs for most of his career, I think, and he knows the reality of that more than the rest of us, I'm sure. But in what has been called, initial caps, the war on drugs, for most of my professional lifetime, there's no doubt that it's resulted in the incarceration of an obscenely higher percentage per capita of people of color than others. And, are we the nation in the world with the highest or second highest per capita number of our citizens, percentage of our citizens in prison? I think China, we're right there with China. It's really close. I think we're number one. So yay. And that's a result largely of drug policy. I mean, when David James was first on the street and working as a detective and everything else, he was enforcing the laws. He wasn't able to write them. He wasn't able to decide which ones not to enforce. To a certain extent, this goes back to the earlier question. We put our police in the United States in an awful position. Policing in a democracy is a very difficult thing anyway, because we have rights, but we need security. And so they're always walking that thin line. And everything about the penal code, I would agree with the premise of the person who asked the question. From the type of crimes that we are enforcing, generally the drug crimes, all the way to what happens when these people are arrested and the bail that is set for them. We don't go to court much anymore, as we were talking about before this began, but to go to motion hour, and if you're part of the criminal motion hour, they bring out these defendants who are not sociopaths, they're not serial killers, they're not even axe murderers. They're people who have been in jail for a year and a half because they can't make bail, and they can't get out for lower level felony drug crimes. And so from A to Z, there could be a dramatic rethinking of how that criminal code works. I don't know if we have the guts or the legislative heart right now to do that.
I open that up to the other panelists if you have thoughts on this issue.
I would simply say, after working all those years enforcing drug laws, that I can remember at one point when I worked for LMPD, talking about the fact that we were spending so much money on enforcement and fractions of that on treatment, and how that we as a city had absolutely no plan to get people off drugs, only a plan to arrest people for drugs, and how that was somewhat ludicrous. And I remember being dressed down by the chief of police at the time because somebody called the mayor's office about me saying something like that out loud to people during a public presentation. And my reply was, then put that in writing and tell me that I'm wrong. And tell me what I lied about. And so they wouldn't do that. But it's true. And so, we, it wasn't until probably 5 years ago, roughly, that the city of Louisville actually had an official drug prevention program, right? And so we are around here, we are not on the progressive side of that, right? And we should be very proactive about that, but we're not. And so I think we have a long ways to go. I think our country has a long ways to go as it relates to our drug policies. Our drug policies have helped exacerbate the issue of systemic racism in our country. It has led to families being destroyed, neighborhoods being ruined, and all because of policies of our government. When you start allowing prisons to be privately run and you can invest stocks in that, especially around the time we're not having a war with somebody, and people need to make money, then, what do you expect is going to happen? And so I agree with what Marc just said.
I'll just point out briefly as a reference point, building upon what Marc and David said, there is an excellent book called Locking Up Our Own by James Foreman Jr. And he totally illustrates everything that was just said. He looks at Washington, D.C. and the nation, and how ironically, Black political leadership, when we have Black mayors, they engaged in this war on crime, and the impact was devastating. So I just wanted to point that out. It's a good, excellent book.
Thank you. This is my final question, and we will start with Marc, but it's for each panelist. Who do you believe is best equipped to heal our community, and why?
Besides David James, you mean?
Sure.
Well, I think that we should have a Black mayor. And I say that knowing that I'll get criticism that you're not picking the right person if you start off by excluding, well, not half, more than half of the people. But I stand by that. First of all, we haven't done a great job picking leaders, elected leaders of any color for a long time, with some exceptions. The very first point I made tonight was that we have a problem of trust. And for instance, I was asked about a week and a half ago by the newspaper if I was interested in the United States Attorney's job. And besides the fact that I'm utterly unelectable, I also said that the last thing that this community needs is another old white man in a position of power. I say a Black mayor because I happen to have right on the tip of my tongue 3 or 4 candidates that I think would make fabulous mayors. And I think the time is right. Also, and then I'll stop, an awful lot of holding an elected position, I believe, is message sending. For Louisville to elect another white male, to limit that category, for all the reasons we've been talking about today, I think would send the wrong message. It also would send the message that we're the only ones who are capable of running an organization as big and complicated with a budget the size of Louisville, Kentucky, which of course we know isn't true. Louisville, the state of Kentucky, and even the United States is behind the rest of the world in having diverse representation in its leadership positions. And I think the time is right. I don't just think anybody, pull a name out of a hat would be the right person to do that. I really do believe that we know that Shamika Parrish Wright has announced her intentions to run for mayor. She's been on the front lines of the issues that have been at the front of our minds for the last year, and then before that with her work. People know that Sadiqa Reynolds, I think, would be a fabulous choice for that. Charles Booker was mentioned frequently for that. I think that more and more, and I'm among the people who believe that he should run against Rand Paul for the United States Senate in 2022. But I think that for lots of reasons, primarily because I think they'd be the most qualified with the issues that we're talking about here today, but also because the message that it sends, and finally because I think the trust that it would build. Not necessarily Daniel Cameron lied to us. So it isn't just that you can, again, pick any person of that race, because look what's happened as a result of his decision and the work that he's done in the Attorney General's office. But these people aren't Daniel Cameron. And I think there's more than who I've just spoken of who could be mayors. You put me on the spot and those are my answers.
Thank you, Marc. President James.
I think that I will agree with Marc partially in that what I believe is that what will help immediately start helping our community heal is we have new leadership at the very top. There's no trust in the current mayor by well over the majority of our community. And we need something to help restart, to jumpstart our city right now. I also would say that the other people that could help change things in our city is us. I think we, as in all of us, as a collective, have to decide that we're going to work together to try to make things better. And until we do that, and what I mean by that, there are people I talk to every day that that are still putting their head in the hole like an ostrich and saying, there's no problems. It's going to go away. When I take my head out of the hole, it's going to be okay. But if we don't all participate in that conversation collectively to fix it, then it's not going to be okay. And we all have to come along on that journey. I had a friend that always used to say, there's no such thing as your side of the canoe is leaking. We're all in it together. And unless we start acting that way, then Louisville will continue to have the problems that it has. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Powell.
Well, thank you for inviting me. This has been a great discussion. And I think Marc left out one mayoral candidate. What about David James? He's my councilman. So
I opened with that.
Think about it. Think about it. Well, I think this notion of healing is an interesting one. It's circulating in our political dialogue now, but I think we have to be very careful about that. And I'm worried about President Biden sort of being the great conciliator and reconciler without looking at these major problems. We had an attempted takeover of the government. And we're looking at that in many contorted ways. Well, what did it come from? We're not listening to certain people. They just want to be heard. This was an attempt to take back the government so that people will be heard, anti-intellectualism, all of these things. But we cannot heal until we address this problem. And this is the third time around that we're trying to deal with race. What's really devastating this time is that there's so many different things happening. We have a pandemic we have to get under control, economic recession, the racial reckoning that we've been talking about most of tonight, climate change, and this insurrection, which was a bold attempt to erode first principles. And the reason we're here again, neutrality again, because when President Trump gave his inaugural address, American Carnage, no one said anything. We just tried to rationalize it. Or every bad thing that he did, we tried to rationalize it and make it normal in our democracy. Oh, he just tells it like it is. Oh, he's really engaging in a political debate. Oh, he meant that, but it was just simply hyperbolic. He could have meant something else. He's really helping the working man. All of these are neutral ways to rationalize oppression. So I think we're at a point where we're no longer sort of rationalizing what's happening. We have to deal with what's happening. Before we can even heal, we have to deal with the wounds that have been sustained to our democracy. And that's going to take a while. This isn't something, these 4 years were devastating. I think President Trump did some generational damage to our prestige domestically and in the world. So it is going to take a while to build up what America is. And we've all embraced this American exceptionism. It couldn't happen here, we're America. But all of that is really fictional until we actually make it work. So that's where the hard work will begin. And I hope it really begins tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you. Sarah's going to close us out, but I just wanted to say thank you to all of our panelists. I think I speak for Sarah as well as myself that I thought today was fantastic. I really appreciated each of your candor. These are certainly not simple topics. There is no one size fits all. It's going to take all of us coming to the table, being open-minded. Certainly, as Professor Powell eloquently stated, actually confronting and addressing and admitting that there have been wounds, deep wounds, is step one, I think. Everyone's touched on, trust. We have to restore it some way, somehow. That has to be our goal. And so I am just very thankful to the LBLA as well as the LBA's Public Service Committee, just deciding to come together with the Charles W. Anderson Jr. Bar Association and do this series. We started with voters' rights, and then we went to criminal law, and we're ending on social justice. And I just want to give a big thanks to Sarah and her committee, as well as all of our panelists and each of our programs. I think this is very much appreciated and needed in our community.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I agree with all of your sentiments completely. And thank you so much to the panelists for your time and participation. Having these discussions is critical to starting that process of healing these wounds. And Michelle was going to mention that we started with voting rights, and we've talked a lot tonight about the importance of voting and what that means for our leadership and building that trust and healing. All of the themes that we've talked about tonight started with voting. We've talked about criminal justice, and here we are wrapping it up with social injustice. So it all comes together. So yes, thank you so much, Michelle, for your partnership. Thank you to our panels, and thank you so much to our audience. This will be recorded and available on the LBA's website, as well as on Facebook if you want to catch it later.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, everybody. Happy New Year.
Same to you. Happy New Year.